Those who know me well know that I hate what I think are dumb questions. This has been a struggle for me my entire life. It's a struggle with me in my parenting. It's a struggle with me in my work. It's a struggle with me as a husband. It's a struggle with me as a friend and as a coworker. I just, for some reason, have a hard time with not reacting to what I think are dumb questions. And what I mean by dumb questions are questions that fall into one of three categories generally. A, questions that I believe I've already answered. Why do I need to answer a question more than once if I've answered it adequately the first time? B, questions whose answers I think are obvious, and therefore the questions shouldn't even need to be asked. Someone should just know what the answer to this is based on knowledge of life or experience or other things. It just shouldn't be something that someone should have to ask. And C, questions whose answers are not interesting to me and thus shouldn't be asked. One of many problems in this approach that I have and this way that I've developed as a person and in my personality is that my definition of what's dumb is very subjective. And I'm taking that definition of a dumb question and I'm imposing it on everybody else by applying my judgment to it. Now, this is going to be my final message in this series about Jesus' response to sin. And so one more time, I just want to walk through where we've been so that it makes sense where we're ending up. So we started out looking at part of the Luke Sermon on the Mount. And we presented the idea that our stance towards sin is often rooted in an arrogance of pointing out the sin of others. And how often our motivation in pointing out the sin of others is to hide the sin that we have in ourselves. Don't look over here, look over there. And from there, we looked at how Jesus battled temptation to sin during his desert testing by Satan in the Gospel of Matthew. We talked about how sin questions our identity. It questions who we are and tries to redefine who we are, not by God's standard, but by the sin we've committed or the consequences of that sin that we've indulged in. It questions God's words. Did God really say? Is the basis of the sin temptation in Genesis 1 with Adam and Eve and also in this encounter that Jesus has with Satan in the desert. And it also questions God's authority. It questions God's authority to rule and to reign and to decide what is right and what is wrong. And sometimes it does this in subtle ways, and we talked about how we can battle against that by knowing our identity, by knowing who we are, and how we need to respond to sin with the kind of grace and compassion that God shows towards us. And we looked at the idea of scapegoating from John chapter 9, and we looked at the story of the man born blind, and how our human inclination is to look for someone to blame when something goes wrong, to assign fault for sin so that we have someone to focus our reaction against it on, which obscures us from focusing on the truth of sin being ultimately defeated through the cross. And we looked at the story then of Zacchaeus, which reminds us that Jesus came to search for sinners, and that we should not be blocking access to Jesus for sinners, inadvertently or otherwise, who are trying to seek him. And so to try to pull all of these threads together, I want to spend some time on a post-resurrection story of an interaction with Peter and Jesus to try to decipher what Jesus' endgame is in his engagement with sin. John chapter 21, verses 15 to 19. Read. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." So again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, When you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted, but when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." And Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." Now recall that this passage follows on the heels of Jesus' third post-resurrection appearance to the disciples, according to the Gospel of John. And in this one, Jesus had appeared on the shore as the disciples were fishing. And perhaps they had gone back to fishing because that was their vocation before being called by Jesus. And with Jesus no longer an itinerant preacher walking around the Galilean and Judean countryside, they went back to what they knew. It could be that they were just looking for dinner, but it also could be that this is a sign that they had given up their apostolic calling to return to the life that they had before Jesus, even though they had seen him in his resurrected body. They had not recognized him at first when he showed up, as Jesus often did in his post-resurrection appearances. And when he had suggested where they should fish, because they hadn't caught any fish yet, and they got a big catch, Peter in particular instantly recognized him. And Peter, in his impatience to greet his Lord, jumped out of the boat, abandoning those, remember, who were trying to haul in this 153 fish, and rushed through the water 100 yards to the shore to greet him. For those of you that golf, that's a good pitching wedge. And they had shared a breakfast meal of fish and bread together. And so the passages we are looking at today begin after this breakfast with Jesus asking Peter a question. In the NIV, the question translates as, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, it's addressed to Peter in a fairly solemn and serious sort of way. He's even using sort of an expanded and official name for Peter. It's like, I don't know about your house, but in our house, when we particularly want our kids to pay attention to something, we'll often use their middle name as well as their first name. So Daniel Paul, or Thomas James, or Emma Ruth Ann, or Rebecca Judith, to indicate that we're serious, that we're calling them in some kind of more formal way, sometimes out of anger and sometimes just out of trying to get their attention. And what exactly he means by more than these in this passage is unclear. It could mean, do you love me more than these other disciples love me? It could mean, do you love me more than you love these disciples? It could also mean, do you love me more than you love these things, these fish, these nets, these boats, these friends, these tools and signs of his old life before he was called to follow Jesus in the way that he was? And perhaps the question was purposely ambiguous the way that John wrote it, so that the implication could point to any of the three, because they're all true. We all have to wrestle with questions in our life of whether there are things that we love more than Jesus, people we love more than Jesus, patterns of living that we love more than Jesus. But regardless of the relational point, the question being asked of Peter is, how deep is your love for your Savior? How deep is your love for Jesus? Now, on the surface, that question can seem like a little bit of a dumb question by Jesus. I mean, hadn't Peter just jumped out of the boat, abandoned all of his friends when they were fishing, and worked his way to shore, wading through the water with a long flowing robe that would have got wet and bunched around his legs and maybe even tripped him up? Certainly it was a very undignified trip to shore to greet Jesus as soon as he realized it was him. And yet, on further review, perhaps it was not so dumb a question after all. As Peter had certainly professed his love for Jesus on many occasions, and particularly strong love. It was clear he shared a particularly special relationship with Jesus. But hadn't it also been Peter, pre-crucifixion, that had scolded Jesus for suggesting that his calling as the Messiah meant that he was going to die in Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans and the Jewish authorities? Hadn't it also been Peter, post-arrest, who had denied knowing Jesus 3 times? And hadn't it also been Peter, post-resurrection, that appears to have been so excited about his risen Lord? So excited about him, though, that he returned to his previous life of fishing. There's a legitimate question to be asked as to whether Peter could accept Jesus as the Messiah that he was instead of as the Messiah that Peter and most of the rest of Israel had hoped he'd be. And so the questions that Jesus asked that seem a little mean and off guard, off base on the surface, may actually seem kind of valid in the circumstances. Now, in typical Peter fashion, he quite honestly probably answers the way that I would have answered. Because the word form for the word you in Peter's response is emphatic. Meaning it might sound in English a little bit more like this. Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And the emphasis on the you know is suggesting that Peter is appealing to the knowledge that Jesus already has of him. In a way, he might even be implying that he doesn't really understand why Jesus even had to ask the question. I mean, in Peter's mind, the answer to this question was 100% completely obvious. Peter had dropped everything to follow him, professed his love for him, had bowed down at his feet and hugged him and worshipped him as he prepared post-resurrection. He'd stated on many times how he'd be willing to do anything for Jesus, that he was following him, and he'd been called the rock that Jesus was going to build his church on. And on top of that, their belief, the disciples' belief, that Jesus possessed a remarkable insight that allowed him to know what others were thinking and feeling, even if they had not spoken it, made the question seem completely superfluous and unnecessary. And so Jesus responds with a charge to Peter to teach or care for his sheep or lambs. And those words are different in the Greek, but they're probably just used interchangeably for effect, not because they mean something different. And they cycle through 3 times in total, these questions. So by the 3rd time, Peter's agitation at the questioning by Jesus becomes less implied and a lot more overt. John actually records that Peter was hurt. Literally, this word implies the idea of grief or sadness or distress or sorrow. So when it says that Peter was hurt, it doesn't just mean he was mildly offended, that he was bothered by the questions, or it means literally that he was deeply wounded and offended that Jesus would even ask this question of him, particularly asking it 3 times. To Peter, it probably sounded as if he didn't believe Peter's answer. You know, I've said to people at times, you can ask me that question as many times as you want. My answer's not going to change. And the implication in saying that is, stop asking. You know, or maybe it was as if Peter was concerned that Jesus could see something in Peter that Peter didn't even know about himself. And so he calls again on Jesus' ability to perceive and see and know all things, with the emphatic statement again that of all people, Jesus should know of Peter's love for him. So the question that we could ask of this narrative, and the question that we could ask about sin in general, is what is Jesus' endgame when it comes to Peter and when it comes to sin? Now, for any of you that like superhero movies that have followed the Marvel Avengers series, Endgame was the last movie in a 22-movie series that took place over 10 or so years, that attempted to tie together all the disparate strands from all the different characters into one ending that completed the story while setting up the possibility for future stories. It meant to pull all the loose threads together to create one sustained narrative from which the Marvel movie universe could move forward. So when I say endgame, I don't mean by this the process of dealing with sin, but I mean what Jesus wants to see as the result of his conversation with Peter, and by extension, what Jesus wants to see as a result of his dealing with sin. It's not clearly stated in the narrative here, as once the Q&A session is complete, Jesus moves on to a cryptic discussion of the nature of Peter's death. But perhaps it can be summed up at least somewhat in the final words of this passage. that Jesus spoke to Peter when he said, "Follow me." Meaning to go or come behind, to accompany, or to be a disciple of Jesus. Now, even though it's not stated explicitly, the symbolism in this narrative is impossible to miss and very unlikely to be coincidental. After swearing he would not ever betray or forsake Jesus, Peter had denied Jesus 3 times after Jesus was arrested, when people pointed out that he looked like one of the men who was with Jesus. He'd done it out of fear for his life. He was afraid of being arrested and beaten or crucified or whatever in the same manner as Jesus. And now 3 times in response to Jesus' inquiry, Peter confirmed his love for Jesus post-resurrection, symbolically canceling the effect of his denial and his concerns about the type of Messiah that Jesus was going to be, freeing the path for him to follow Jesus and restoring him fully to the position of leadership that Jesus had in mind for him when he called Peter the rock on which he would build his church. So I think there's a way that Jesus knew that Peter had to get past and deal with the mistakes he'd made in the past in order to be able to fully live into what Jesus had in mind for Peter's future. Now, that doesn't mean that we keep dragging our past up or keep bringing it with us or continue to allow it to impact the way that we live now. But it does say that it's not necessarily as simple as just forgetting it and moving on. That there's some kind of process that Jesus accompanies us on that allows us to put the past behind us, to experience restoration from our mistakes and our shortcomings, and to be able to live fully into the life that he has for us in the here and the now. To be used by God on behalf of Jesus in the way and the manner and in the time that God had always hoped and planned and laid out for us. See, at the end of the day, the end game for Jesus in dealing with sin isn't bringing it to light in the sense of displaying it to those around us. You look at how he took Peter aside and had this conversation with him one-on-one instead of having it in front of all of the other apostles who were there eating breakfast. It isn't about enforcing guilt and shame on the one who sinned. He never even mentioned to Peter the ways in which Peter's questioning of why Jesus would even ask whether he loved him might have been valid, or the mistakes that had been made. It isn't about ensuring us a spot on the everlasting life train. He focused on Peter's life in the here and now and what he had planned for him in his immediate future more than he did about where Peter would spend eternity. And it isn't about punishment for sin. There is no hint of this in this exchange with Jesus and Peter. But this whole narrative is entirely 100% about restoration. It's about removing the stain of sin and the lies that it tells us about God and about others and about ourselves, so that we are unimpeded in our purpose to follow God in our vocation to represent him through the lives we live today. Jesus wanted to remove from Peter's path every impediment that would stop him from following Jesus and living out his life to the fullest extent of what God had in mind for him. And in the same way, God wants to remove through Jesus the sin that drags us down, the things that cause us to not experience life in the way that God intended life to be, so that we can live fully into who God created us to be. And so that we can experience fully the world that God created us to rule and inhabit. This is what he had in mind for Zacchaeus. This is what he had in mind for the woman caught in adultery. This is what he has in mind for Peter. This is what he has in mind for all who follow him. And so if we can see sin as something that we are offering restoration from, instead of something that we are offering judgment for, then we too can experience what it's like to have those stumbling blocks removed and to be able to follow after God fully and completely in the way that He intends and according to the gifts that we've received. As I hope that we can take out of this isn't a sense that sin is unimportant and shouldn't be dealt with or identified, because I don't believe that's what I said, and I don't believe that that's what we see in what Jesus did in Scripture. But I do hope that we walk away with a reminder that the point of dealing with sin, the end game of sin in this world and this life, is intended to be restoration from it, so that we can live fully into who God created us to be. Jesus, take the beauty from the pain. Jesus, lift these weary hands again. Turn the silence into songs of praise. Jesus, I am leaning on your name. I'm leaning on you. I'm leaning on you. I'm leaning on you. I'm leaning on you. When no one else can help me, Jesus can. Every other name is sinking sand. Even when my heart don't understand, Jesus, I will trust you even then. I'm leaning on you. I'm leaning on you. I'm leaning on you. I'm leaning on you. I'm convinced that nothing can ever separate us from God's love. Neither death nor life, no power on earth can separate us. I'm confident that nothing can ever separate us from God's great love. Neither death nor life, no power on earth, you promised us. Confident that nothing can ever separate us from God's love. Neither death nor life, no power on earth can separate us. I'm convinced that nothing can ever separate us from God's great love. Neither death nor life, no power on earth, you promised us. I'm leaning on